Hello and welcome to another Q&A video. As always, there was a great set of questions this past month, so let's get started. So Tim Tom 9503, how much credibility would you lend to recent reports of Russia preparing a full-on attack of NATO territory by 2029? Tied to this, Paramhamsa Yogananda 6719 asks, can Europe defend itself against Russia without American support? So look, it's really very difficult to sort of make sense of this. And I think one of the things that, for any of us who are following the war in Ukraine and where Russia stands, is just how many conflicting reports you have of this. I'm always reminded of the fact that, they're sort of every other week there's something sort of saying Russian economy is on the verge of collapse. And we've been seeing this. The war in Ukraine is now coming up for its, it's about to start its, 4 years. This has been going on a very long time, and we have not yet seen the Russian economy collapse. Now, it might be on the verge of collapse. Likewise, you've had people sort of saying, no, Russia is winning the war in Ukraine. It's about to break through and, sort of make great advances and everything like that. I think the reality is that we can't actually get a very clear picture of what's happening exactly. And I think so. This makes sort of trying to make a bigger estimate about what Russia is planning all the more difficult. Part of me says that it seems absolutely unrealistic to think that Russia would be ready to attack Europe in any way, simply because we just have to look at what's happened in Ukraine. So yes, Russian forces may be making advances at the moment, but it has, Ukraine has inflicted horrific losses on Russia. That progress has been incredibly slow. And this is, if you like, Ukraine fighting with one hand tied behind its back. It hasn't been given the sort of weaponry that it could have been given. It hasn't been given the support that it could have been given. And so there is a sense that, if Russia has been tied up in this way against Europe, against Ukraine, what chance would it have if it were to, launch an attack on Europe? It would be absolutely suicidal. But I think that in many ways that's made complicated by a number of factors. I think the fact that it was raised about can Europe defend itself against Russia without American support is incredibly important in all of this, because this is the big question, and this is the big worry that many in Europe will be having at the moment, especially given the fact that we just simply don't know where Trump stands on Russia. Well, we probably do know where Trump stands on Russia, but would invading Europe be a step too far that would require the United States to take some sort of action? Whether Trump sort of says, listen, Vladimir, you can have eastern Ukraine, but I can't let you have the rest of Ukraine, or I can't certainly let you have parts of Europe. We just don't know. But it seems very, very unlikely that the United States would be willing to go that far. But also, I think the other thing that, we have to bear in mind is that, would there be that cohesion within Europe if steps were taken? And how far would Europe really be willing to go? So there's the argument that that Russia, for all its weakness, actually has quite a lot in reserve that it hasn't been using in Ukraine. I don't know whether that's true or not, but if that's a plausible argument, then obviously it would suggest that a war against Europe is going to be so much more serious than perhaps we've lulled ourselves into thinking it is. That, oh, look at what Ukraine's managed to do against Russia. If Russia were to try anything against Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, then, it hasn't got a hope. It might have more forces. The second factor, of course, is that American support. Would the United States come in to defend? The third factor is, what about Europe? Can Europe be relied upon to be absolutely in lockstep on the position it takes towards Russia if that were to happen? And of course, we think about, those countries in Europe, sort of, for example, Hungary and Viktor Orban's close relationship with Putin, Robert Fico in Slovakia. There may be other European countries which just simply say, well, you know what, this is not our issue. We're not going to be willing to fight on this. So you'd have questions about, could you rely on NATO to actually act in a unanimous way if that were to happen? Would Turkey be fully behind taking military action against Russia? Would America, would the Hungarians, would the Slovaks? You start to see cracks that could emerge, which would be absolutely lethal in the event that this happened, that you can't afford to have those cracks. And so I think there are real questions. And Putin might be thinking to himself that actually you can exploit this, and that if you do it in a very careful way, so if you start sort of trying to roll in tanks across sort of, multiple fronts, then, maybe you're going to get a reaction. But if you start to sort of nibble away at certain parts and sort of saying, well, we've got a Russian community in Estonia, and we feel that they should be, they're being discriminated against, we need to protect them, and you have concepts of false flag operations, an atrocity is committed against Russians living in Latvia or Lithuania, and then Moscow would say, well, this shows exactly why we need to go and defend them. These are sorts of scenarios which may seem unrealistic, but I think can't be entirely discounted. But I think there's another element in all of this, which is we are envisaging this as very standard, if you like, warfare. And we really have to consider that warfare in these days is also fought in what we call hybrid warfare. And I think that this is something that we're already starting to see, which is one of the reasons why I think we have to be more nervous about this possibility than perhaps we were even a couple of years ago. The fact that we have been seeing this drone activity taking place over Europe, and Europe doesn't really know what to do about it. Does it start shooting down these drones? What would be the response that would come from that? The fact that we've seen sort of Russian spy ships off the coast of northwest Europe, so off the coast of Scotland, off the coast of Ireland, and some would say, well, Ireland's neutral, it's not important. It's incredibly important because, of course, the undersea cables that link Europe with North America run out of Ireland. So if Russia wanted to disrupt communications, it could do so very, very easily by cutting those cables. So it's not as unimportant as some might say. And this is all part and parcel of, what we're seeing, Russian disinformation campaigns. There are very, very real questions about Russian support for far-right parties in Europe. There's a campaign that's emerging in the UK to press for an inquiry on Russian involvement in British politics. Anyone who might have been following British politics might have actually sort of noticed that the former leader of Reform, so Nigel Farage's party in Wales, and a former close political ally of Nigel Farage, has just been jailed for a number of years for taking bribes from Moscow to push Russian propaganda. So, we know that there are very, very real ways that, Russia is already, if you like, attacking Europe, that needs to be thought about. So the idea that then this could potentially lead to some sort of militarized action, I don't think can be completely discounted. I think, it still seems less likely than some might suggest, a full-scale attack. But as I say, I think there is enough doubt there that should be giving us all very, very serious reasons to be concerned. Higuita Max says, I insist, why wouldn't Taiwan seek a nuclear deterrent? I'm guessing that the I insist refers to the fact that you probably asked it in the previous month. And again, to anyone who watches, I'm just so sorry if I don't get round to answering your questions. I do get rather a lot each month, and I try and do as many as I can. But, even if I get through 8 questions, that may be only sort of 5 to 10% of the number of questions that I'm usually asked. So many apologies for that. But look, turning to your question, look, this is actually really, really interesting. And in one sense, I can see where you're coming from. You would think that, Taiwan is obviously in an extremely vulnerable position, that, it lies very close to China, that China has become more and more overt in its claims to have direct control over Taiwan in recent years. We are increasingly talking about the possibility, if not of an invasion, then certainly of maybe a siege of Taiwan that would eventually lead to Taiwanese capitulation. There's all sorts of questions about whether the United States could be relied on to come to Taiwan's defense, that while the United States has traditionally had close relations with Taipei and maintains a semi-official sort of diplomatic of sorts office there, even though it doesn't recognize it, and has suggested that it would be prepared to defend Taiwan, there are questions about how deeply embedded that is. So in that sense, it would seem to make a lot of sense for Taiwan to explore the idea of having nuclear weapons and saying to China, look, whatever happens between us, it's not to happen militarily, and we will defend ourselves. I think, there are a number of reasons why, on the other hand, this probably wouldn't be a good idea and actually might be very, very difficult to achieve. I think that, producing nuclear weapons is obviously extremely difficult in all sorts of ways. I mean, it's a very technical process. I think it's probably safe to say that if Taiwan wanted to do it from a technical perspective, a scientific perspective, it could do it. It could do it very easily. But it also means being able to get the materials to be able to do it. And there is probably, and not claiming for one moment to be an expert on constructing nuclear weapons, but I would imagine that that would be extremely difficult to be able to do. And I think the danger is if it started to emerge that Taiwan was engaged in a nuclear program, then would that actually antagonize Beijing to the point that Beijing would then say, right, now that gives us a real reason to impose a blockade on Taiwan and say to the rest of the world, look, they're developing a nuclear weapon. We cannot allow this to happen off our coast. We would respectfully ask no one gets involved in all of this. And it would actually, I think, make it even more dangerous in that sense. And I think one could definitely see Beijing taking a much tougher position. And I think the international community would also be very, very unhappy about this, that we're living in a time where we do genuinely worry about nuclear proliferation. We obviously have the 5 declared nuclear states, and then, we are seeing other countries starting to develop them. And there is a real concern that more and more countries, and I use that term for Taiwan, even though, obviously very aware that it falls into a very strange position in international relations. But be that as it may, I think that there would be real concern if Taiwan were to move in that direction. Now, some might be sympathetic to the idea and say, listen, we understand because of the threat from Beijing. But I think in many ways it could actually escalate the situation if it did emerge that Taiwan was trying to develop nuclear weapons. And I don't think it's a secret you could keep for terribly long. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why that would be the case. But I think that China is probably very, very active on its intelligence and would be aware of this. And so if it did emerge that Taiwan was trying to do this, then I think it could actually make matters far worse rather than make Taiwan even more secure. So that would be my sense, at least, on why Taiwan isn't seeking a nuclear deterrent, and why probably on balance it shouldn't, even though, as I say, I can understand the nervousness that many in Taiwan will be feeling about China's position at the moment. John M161 asks, what are some of the lesser known historical injustices of the last century? What factors are there behind some incidents being ingrained in our collective consciousness, whereas others of similar scale are unknown to the general public? John, thank you for this, because I think this touches on something that, any of us who work on conflict have often asked ourselves. Why is it that some conflicts, some developments, genocides, ethnic cleansing, get a lot of attention, whereas others simply seem to pass by? Now, interesting, in the 1990s, there was something, there was a lot written about what was called the CNN effect, about how, when CNN would go into a situation and cast light on what was happening, then that would spur policymakers to take action and bring it to the attention of publics, who would then sort of say, we must do something. And it's very much a known element in all of this that it hasn't, in actual fact, seem to have caught on in other cases. And we know that there are many examples of conflicts where these are terrible developments that are taking place, and yet they seem to pass by. So I'm thinking, for example, in recent years, a very good example was the horrific war that took place in Tigray in Ethiopia just a few years ago. There was barely any reporting of this in the media, in the international media, certainly in the Western media. How many people had heard about it? And yet this was a horrific conflict where, obviously there are all sorts of estimates about how many died, but, the figure that seems to be generally accepted is 500,000 people. where was this? Looking at what's happening in Sudan, this is woefully underreported. And so, these are events that are taking place at the moment. So you can quickly see, why is it that if that's the case now, then things that were taking place 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, a century ago, would have fallen out of public consciousness. So I think, one has to ask, but why is it that certain things have been able to maintain? And I think the one thing that's really interesting, so, you sort of talk about the slave trade in the Congo, you talk about the Armenian genocide, you talk about the Holocaust, is of course that these are atrocities where you have communities that continue to exist and are to some degree or another politicized over this. And I don't mean politicized in a negative way. I'm just sort of saying that there is a consciousness about their historical past that translates into political action, that translates into a sense of cohesion, translates into a sense of we must keep this alive and continue talking about it, that this can't be allowed to just disappear into history. This is fundamental to who we are as a people. And I think that this really becomes in many ways a critical factor of this. But it's not just sort of, that they exist within a country. I think what's very telling, of course, is that these are essentially diaspora communities. So when you're talking about the slave trade, this is the Black American community. When you're talking about the Armenian genocide, you're talking about communities that exist in France, a very strong community in the United States. When you're talking about the Holocaust, of course, you've got the Jewish community that exists in the United States, which keep this alive. And so it becomes very much sort of front and center within other countries, not just the countries where it took place. So I think all of this comes together and obviously sort of creates a rather special set of circumstances that work in some situations but not in others, and hence why we forget many of the factors, many of the things that took place. So, for example, you talk about sort of what happened in, with the Armenians, with the Jewish people during the Second World War. But of course, many would often say the first genocide of the 20th century actually took place in Africa, in Namibia, which was then under German control, that has largely been forgotten. Very, very few people know about what happened in Namibia, and the horrific events there. You also had mentioned about the Congo. Very few people know about the Congo and just how utterly horrific Belgian rule is. Now, Belgian rule over the Congo was, and it really was. I mean, it was atrocious, even by the standards of colonialism. Most would say that this was particularly horrific, brutal. And I would advise anyone, who has an interest in this subject, who might not, about history, who might not know, go and have a look. I mean, it really is, some of the pictures and things of that are really, really difficult to view. And yet it doesn't tend to be very well known. I mean, there is, interestingly, again, rather gives rise to this, there is a campaign for this to be recognised. I mean, you now have Congolese who are living outside of Congo who are trying to raise awareness of this and sort of make sure that this is remembered. But of course, so we can talk about others. I think, another one which I think is really, really interesting is Bosnia. Bosnia now, there is a very, very strong campaign to remember Srebrenica, which was the horrific massacre that took place in 1995, where an estimated 8,000 Muslim men and boys were killed by Bosnian Serb forces. It's very interesting to see how active a community has emerged around that, and how this is now commemorated in many countries each year and has become a major event. And yet others would argue, but there were all sorts of other atrocities that were being committed, which have fallen by the wayside. And why is this one? Well, again, I think it's largely because this was seen as a campaign against Muslims in Europe. And I think this has actually become rather interestingly for many Muslims living in Europe to say, look, here is an example of atrocities that were committed against us within Europe, that, you know, shows that sort of Islamophobia that many would sort of point to existing, and sort of saying, look, you know, this exists. This was an atrocious, horrific event that took place within the European continent, and it was only 30 years ago. So very much within living memory. So I think, you know, this is a really, really interesting question. It's not entirely clear why the media will settle on some conflicts and not others. You know, and it doesn't always follow rhyme or reason. But I think certainly when you then look at back in a historical sense, I think that it's very easy to see why so many incidents, so many events, so many tragedies have been ignored or forgotten, and that there's a very specific set of circumstances that seem to have to exist if you're going to get them to be remembered. The Reaping Gecko 9164 asks, do you consider Niue and the Cook Islands to be their own countries? The UN considers them to be non-member states, but the Cook Island president stated that they didn't meet the requirements to become a member, but they seem to operate almost completely as countries. So thank you for this. So, you know, this is one of those questions which might seem really, really obscure, but to any of us who are interested in statehood, this is absolutely fascinating. Because, of course, you touch on a concept in international relations where we talk about free association. So this is a really interesting concept in international politics for a certain number of territories that in many ways exist as independent states, but have passed over elements of their sovereign rights on foreign policy, defense policy, maybe even financial policy to another country. But there are actually two categories. So there's two that actually have this idea of free association. New Zealand is one of those, and this is where Niue and Cook Islands come into it. And the United States is the other. So you have several, in the case of the United States, if I remember rightly, it's Marshall Islands, Palau, and Micronesia that are in free association with the United States. But what's really interesting is that the US conception of free association and the New Zealand conception of free association are different from each other. So in the case of the United States says these countries are in free association. We have a large degree of control over their sort of foreign and security policy, not entire control. They still act as independent states, but essentially they follow our line. So very often when you will see the United States vote against something in the General Assembly, take a look at how the Marshall Islands have voted, because I guarantee that they will be in lockstep. So even if it's a really obscure issue or an issue where the United States is really isolated on the international stage, there will be the Marshall Islands, and that will explain it. So in the American case, as I've just said, those countries are members of the United Nations. They're considered to be independent, separate states, but they have this free association relationship with the United States. New Zealand takes a slightly different position, or quite a big different position. It says, look, these effectively exist as independent states, but they're not entirely independent. And even though they have certain rights to make their own decisions on certain foreign policy issues and things like that, if they want to continue getting money from us and having a relationship with us, they can't be full members of the United Nations. So New Zealand, so some would say this maybe is a colonial situation. I think it's more complex than that. It's a very, very difficult relationship to categorize. But it is different from that American approach to free association, which I've always found fascinating. So, whereas the UN would say, yes, look, they are non-member states. They have all the hallmarks of independence, but they're not allowed to officially be fully independent and full members of the United Nations because New Zealand has laid these conditions on them. But then you point out the Cook Island president says it didn't meet the requirements to become a member. But, the requirements to become a member are actually sort of, I think, loose enough that they could tomorrow very easily become members. You've got to meet the terms of the Charter and the values of the Charter. And you've got to also meet the terms of what is a state in international relations. So, you would say that, that's a defined territory. Well, they have that. Settled population. Well, they have that. capacity for governance. They have that, but maybe is the area where, you can raise some questions. And then the final one is the ability to enter into relations with other states. They quite clearly have that. If they declared independence tomorrow, they wouldn't need to have embassies in every country. No country has that. They would only need a select few. So they might set up one in New Zealand. They probably have a representation. Well, they would have a representation at the United Nations. Then they might have one or two more. So they might be with a nearby Pacific Island state. And then maybe, just one or two others, Beijing or Washington, being obvious candidates for it. So I think they could be, but I think, as I say, the constraint traditionally has been that New Zealand, unlike the United States, takes a very different position on this, and it is fascinating to see this concept of free association, and whether this actually is it's a model that, as I say, has these two distinct, interesting variations to it. Pontimin4173 asks, what do you think the foreign policy implications of developments in AI will be? This is fascinating because, obviously we're all talking about AI at the moment. And I have to say that, I am, on balance, an AI optimist. I see that it is doing incredible things. I am also aware of its limitations, and I was just talking with somebody this morning about reading a really interesting article in the past few days about how AI, obviously, we know how it's overtaking sort of Google search results and things like that. But in certain areas, it's having disastrous effects. And, there's a fascinating article talking about recipes. And AI is throwing together these recipes and also throwing in AI pictures of what, in AI's mind, so to speak, would look like a beautiful cake. But if you actually try and make it according to the AI recipe, it just becomes sludge. It just can't work, and it's just there's a serious point to it because it's causing a lot of damage to websites that traditionally have made money off providing recipes. That these are things that have been tested. They know they can be right clearly this is working. So AI does have its downsides, but I do believe that it has all sorts of positive sides. But funnily enough, for all of that, when you ask about the foreign policy implications, this is something I hadn't really given much thought to, if I'm to be honest. And I think, in several ways, it's really, really interesting because you then start to think about how would it be used. So, look, you've got the basic drafting documents, letters. You can see how AI can be used for that. There are, in fact, important security concerns, of course, and many companies are actually having to look at this. You can't just simply use ChatGPT, in secure environments. You can't feed ChatGPT all these, highly sensitive documents about foreign policy and say, can you collate this? So you have to create your own siloed AI in order to be able to do that. Organizations have to be able to do it, and they have to be, absolutely sure that that's secure. So you've got that practical element, but then you can actually see how maybe AI can be used for the very run-of-the-mill things in organizations, foreign affairs ministries, that you would use it in anywhere else. You see how AI can be a very useful tool for condensing information, but again, subject to those concerns, those security concerns that we would have. But I'm just sort of trying to think in more sort of expansive terms about how AI could be used and how it will shape foreign policy. And it really is. It's a fascinating question, and I'd have to say, much as I'd love to sort of give you some sort of really well thought out answer on all of this, it's difficult to see because I think, like so much else, we are in this period of rapid evolution, and it becomes easier to see where AI can work in more technical areas. So, for example, software development, speaking to friends who are software developers, and they're saying just how much AI now factors into it. In medicine, you can see immediately how much AI is sort of coming into diagnostic procedures, the research, the scientific research that's been done in all sorts of areas. And then you start to think, well, how would that apply in foreign policy? Where would the big changes come. I mean, apart from sort of drafting speeches and things like that, I'm sure could do very, very good job of that. But, in terms of where actual policy implications, where it could make its big mark, and if it's already starting to make a mark, it'd be really, really interesting. This is one of those times I'm going to throw it over to you all. Put in the comments below where you think that it will be making some big changes. As I say, I mean, I think we can all see, in terms of procedural ways and processes and things where it could potentially, as I say, subject to the points I've already made, make an impact. But in terms of the big picture, where is AI really going to play its part? It will be fascinating to see. And as I say, I'm not one of these who takes a very pessimistic view of AI and sort of say, and I still see a lot of people out there, oh, AI is overhyped and it's overplayed and everything like that. Yeah, no, it's not. It quite, it is a very, very serious, it's making serious changes. And I think, as I say, in a lot of ways good, but we do definitely need to be thinking a lot more of where its negative effects. Defence and security, I think, is obviously one, separating that out from foreign policy, where we can say, we need to really think very hard. And there has been thought on autonomous weaponry, for example. What happens when you start really building AI into weapon systems and the effects that will have. And that, I guess, by knock-on effects, could be where it's having, on foreign policy. If you're starting to see automated weapon systems that then start violating sovereignty of other countries, let alone sort of targeting, foreign forces, civilians, then we're in a very, very different world. But in terms of sort of foreign policy, as you would sort of think of it, sort of more traditionally defined, it'd be interesting to see where it goes. Unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for this video. Many thanks as always for watching, and see you in the next video.